Elizabeth at A Literary Princess. If you are new here, welcome. I have a PhD in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists, and as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have another installment in my Elizabeth Gaskell project for you, and we will be looking at Cranford from 1853. So, how does this work? I will start with a brief history and summary of the book before moving into what I saw for major themes. Hello, Pippin. Okay. And then ending with my thoughts on this as a book. Please do be aware there will be spoilers, so if you do not want to know the details of Cranford, you should not watch this video. Let's jump in. Cranford was put out in the same year as Ruth, so we don't really have any more stuff going on with Gaskell herself other than just her continuing to write. So, Cranford was actually serialized from December 1851 to May of 1853 in the magazine Household Words, which was run by Dickens. It was then in June of 1853 put out in one volume by Chapman and Hall, who had done all of the rest of Gaskell's books. Gaskell also returned to Cranford 10 years later in a short story called The Cage at Cranford for a November 1863 edition of Dickens' other magazine, All Year Round. That short story is included here in the back. The town of Cranford itself is actually based on the town where Gaskell grew up. Knutsford is how I would pronounce it. I'm gonna have it up here somewhere because I know that sometimes British town names are not pronounced how you would think they would be, so I don't know. And she had actually written about it in an article in 1849 called The Last Generation in England, and you'll notice that that article has a lot of the same details that we find in the opening chapters of Cranford. Particularly notable is the cow in flannel pajamas after falling into a lime pit, I think it was, or something like that. So apparently that really happened. Okay. What is Cranford about? Cranford is an episodic novel focused on the town of Cranford, and the genteel society is almost entirely made up of elderly spinsters and widows. Like, there's basically no men in this town except for the working class men. And as I said, it's very episodic, so there isn't really quite a full plot, but it is largely focused on the character of Matilda Jenkins, or as she is known, Miss Matty. She is the daughter of the former rector, and her sister Deborah were living together. Deborah passes away shortly after the beginning of the book. And we are kind of watching Miss Matty and the other ladies of Cranford through the eyes of Mary Smith, who comes to visit quite frequently from the neighboring, kind of more industrial town of Drumble. And Mary is younger than them, but she's not, it doesn't seem like she's young. Like, she's not like 18. It seems more like she's in her kind of late 20s, maybe even early 30s. It's hard to tell. We go through several episodes of various things happening, an unexpected engagement, stories of old love affairs, and a very, very funny episode of everyone panicking about some break-ins that have been happening around Cranford. And then the final part of the book focuses on Miss Matty when the bank that her sister invested their money in fails. So she is now lost almost all of her income, and her friends in Cranford rally together to figure out a way for her to continue to live in a style that she is accustomed to that won't cause her to lose class. So they help her set up a tea shop in her old house. Her house, the lease on her house is taken over by her servant, who just like straight up refuses to leave her. And it's going very well. The ladies of the town pool what little money they have so that they can give to Miss Maddie and help her stay afloat. And it ends with her long-lost brother Peter returning from India after Mary Smith has kind of done some investigating into where he might be. And he comes home, and then they are able to close the tea shop and return to life as usual. So that's like the basics. There's details of all the different episodes that I have not talked about, but that's like the basic idea of this book. So let's move into some major themes. So the first kind of like most obvious theme is that of gender, and we get it right from the opening sentences. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple comes to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighboring commercial town of Drumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were there? The surgeon has his rounds of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford, but every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed to speck them, for frightening away little boys who look wistfully at the said flowers through the railings, for rushing out at the geese that occasionally venture into the gardens if the gates are left open, for deciding all questions of literature and politics without troubling themselves with unnecessary reasons or arguments, for obtaining clear and correct knowledge of everybody's affairs in the parish, for keeping their neat maidservants in admirable order, for kindness, somewhat dictatorial, to the poor, and real tender good offices to each other whenever they are in distress, the ladies of Cranford are quite sufficient. A man, as one of them observed to me once, is so in the way in the house. So there's very few men, and they're like, we don't need them. In the short story, The Cage at Cranford, so it's not technically part of the book Cranford, but it is in this this Penguin edition, and I think it's definitely worth the read too. Our narrator, Mary, says, "We called on Miss Maddie, of course, and then on Mrs. Hoggins. It seemed as if ill luck would have it that we went to the only two households of Cranford where there was an encumbrance of a man. And in both places the man was where he ought not to have been, namely, in his own house and in the way." And Deborah Jenkins, Miss Maddie's sister, is said that she would have despised the modern idea of women being equal to men. Equal indeed. She knew they were superior. So this is a town run by women. And their opinions on marriage are kind of like, they're down on marriage. At one point, one woman, Lady Glenmire, gets engaged to the surgeon, Mr. Hawkins, who they think is kind of below them in status. And they are very surprised that Lady Glenmire, who is, you know, has this aristocratic title, would lower herself to marry this guy. And also, why would she want to marry at all, is kind of the question. Miss Pole, another of the women, began a long congratulation to Miss Maddie that so far they had escaped marriage, which she noticed always made people credulous to the last degree. Indeed, she thought it argued a great natural credulity in a woman if she could not keep herself from being married. So that's what they all say in front of each other, but then they kind of have some different opinions in private. So Miss Maddie later says to Mary, "Only don't be frightened by Miss Pole from being married. I can fancy it may be a very happy state, and a little credulity helps one through life very smoothly, better than always doubting and seeing difficulties and disagreeables in everything." But Lady Glenmeyer's engagement is a whole thing. And Miss Maddie says at one point, one does not know whose turn may come next. Here in Cranford, poor Lady Glenmeyer might have thought herself safe. So this idea of marriage is a bad thing again. But then Mary observes, I don't know if it is a fancy of mine or a real fact, but I have noticed that just after the announcement of an engagement in any set, the unmarried ladies in that set flutter out in an unusual gaiety and newness of dress, as much as to say, in tacit and unconscious manner, we are also spinsters. Miss Maddie and Miss Pole talked and thought more about bonnets, gowns, caps, and shawls during the fortnight that succeeded this call than I had known them to do for years before. So while they are like always poo-pooing marriage, there is also this kind of idea that it can be a very useful thing. And that is because in Victorian society, being married was very useful for a woman in many ways. And Miss Maddie comments upon this later on. I don't mean to deny that men are troublesome in a house. But still, a man has a sort of knowledge of what should be done in difficulties, that it is very pleasant to have one at hand ready to lean upon. Now, Lady Glenmeyer, instead of being tossed about and wondering where she is to settle, will be certain of a home among pleasant and kind people, such as our good Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester. So, getting married settles Lady Glenmeyer in an establishment. She is a widow, and she does not have very much money. And she has put her house in Edinburgh out to rent, and is just kind of going to relatives and friends to stay. So this marriage gives her a stability that she otherwise would not have as a woman on her own. And we see this problem come up with Miss Maddie when the bank her money is invested in fails. The question is, what is she going to do? Mary says, I thought of all the things by which a woman past middle age and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago could earn or add to a living without materially losing caste. But at length I put even this last clause on one side and wondered what in the world Miss Maddie could do. She determines teaching is something Miss Maddie can't do because she does not have the education to do it. Her eyesight is failing, so she can't take in like fine pieces of sewing to do. She does not have the talents of drawing or music that could be used to tutor in those things. So she is left as this genteel woman with no money and no way to earn that money. They do eventually circumvent this with the idea of a tea shop, and it being like they set it up not quite as a shop, but it's more like just a parlor, but people come in and buy tea. But it's a very real problem for women of this time period, that if they're on their own, they're unmarried or they're widowed, how do they support themselves? And this moves into the next theme I wanted to talk about, which is money and social class, which are really tied together in this book. So the women of Cranford are of a genteel social rank. They're not aristocratic, but they are not middle class, like middle working class, like the surgeon or the shopkeepers. But they're also not rich. They don't have a lot of money because, again, they are women on their own. Mary says, I imagine that a few of the gentlefolks of Cranford were poor and had some difficulty in making both ends meet, but they were like the Spartans and concealed their smart under a smiling face. We none of us spoke of money because that subject savored of commerce and trade, and though some might be poor, we were all aristocratic. The idea is that they have like these aristocratic backgrounds, like, oh, well, so-and-so is descended from this family, or, oh, her cousin was this. So they have these like aristocratic connections without being aristocrats themselves. So Maddie is explaining what happens after the death of their father. And of course, our circumstances were changed, and instead of living at the rectory and keeping 3 maids and a man, we had to come to this small house and be content with a servant of all work. But as Deborah used to say, we have always lived genteelly, even if circumstances have compelled us to simplicity. It's the case for all of these women, although they try very hard not to show it to each other. At one point, they are looking at fabric for new gowns. And Miss Maddie says, I wish I could have a gown for every season, she said, dropping her voice, as we all did in Cranford, whenever we talked of anything we wished for but could not afford. Because you don't want people to know. There's very much this, like, keeping up appearances. When Miss Maddie's bank fails, the ladies come together and are discussing what they can do for Miss Maddie. Miss Pole says, I imagine we none of us are what may be called rich, though we all possess a genteel competency, sufficient for tastes that are elegant and refined, and would not, if they could, be vulgarly ostentatious. She then continues, one and all of us have agreed that while we have a superfluity, it is not only a duty, but a pleasure, a true pleasure, to give what we can to assist her, Miss Matilda Jenkins, only in consideration of the feeling of delicate independence existing in the mind of every refined female. We wish to contribute our mites in a secret and concealed manner, so as not to hurt the feelings I have referred to. So they're all very prideful about this. But when Miss Maddie is in need, they do come to her aid, which is really sweet. Like, it's a really touching part. And again, touching on the pride, at one point, when Lady Glenmire first comes to visit her sister-in-law, Mrs. Jameson, Mrs. Jameson says that she doesn't want all of them coming to visit. Mrs. Jameson came now to insinuate pretty plainly that she did not particularly wish that the Cranford ladies should call upon her sister-in-law. I can hardly say how she made this clear, for I grew very indignant and warm, while with slow deliberation she was explaining her wishes to Miss Maddie, who, a true lady herself, could hardly understand the feeling which made Mrs. Jameson wish to appear to her noble sister-in-law as if she only visited county families. And Miss Pole is very indignant of this as well. And says, and Lady Glenmire is but the widow of a Scotch baron, after all. I went on to look at Mrs. Forrester's peerage to see who this lady was, that is to be kept under a glass case. Widow of a Scotch peer, never sat in the House of Lords, and as poor as Job, I dare say, and she, 5th daughter of some Mr. Campbell or other. You are the daughter of a rector, at any rate, and related to the Arleys, and Sir Peter might have been Viscount Arley, everyone says. Themes of gender and social class and money kind of all are interwoven. And the last theme that I want to mention is this just kind of idea of kindness and living in harmony. So the person who introduced this in this edition, which Pippin, it would be a lot easier if you were not taking up my lap, but okay. Patricia Ingram notes that there was this kind of thought that women didn't get on with each other, and that that friendships with just women didn't quite work. Let me find the exact quote. Ingram writes, but by her treatment of Cranford society, Gaskell is engaging with the contemporary debate which raged in the mid-19th century concerning, among other matters, that of the ability of women without men to form friendships with their own sex or to thrive in an all-female community. An insistence that women could do neither of these things followed from a belief in the doctrine of separate spheres. Since this meant that women and men were seen as complementary to each other, those women who were without men were thus seen as lacking what was necessary to existence. There was much discussion for and against the view that women were capable of creating friendship and living harmoniously with other women. So part of this book is Gaskell showing, like, yes, women can live harmoniously with women. We have this near utopian town that is almost all women who are incredibly kind and supportive of each other. And that is repeatedly pointed out. Mary says, somehow goodwill reigns among them to a considerable degree. The Cranford ladies have only an occasional little quarrel, spirited out in a few peppery words and angry jerks of the head, just enough to prevent the even tenor of their lives from becoming too flat. Miss Jessie, who is a young woman in the kind of first episode, says at one point, but to be sure, what a town Cranford is for kindness. And that episode shows it, because these ladies, even though one of them is like kind of having a spat with Captain Brown, Miss Jessie's father, they come to her aid when Captain Brown dies and her sister is passing away. They're sitting with her, they're bringing things for her, they're making sure that they don't talk about Captain Brown being dead in front of the dying sister because she doesn't know. So it's just a really lovely show of community, much as we see with when Miss Maddie's bank fails. All of this kind of centers around Miss Maddie toward the end. So after the meeting of the ladies, Mary says, I told him, her father, of the meeting of Cranford ladies at Miss Pole's the day before. He kept brushing his hand before his eyes as I spoke, and when I went back to Martha's offer the evening before of receiving Miss Maddie as a lodger, he fairly walked away from me to the window and began drumming with his fingers upon it. Then he turned abruptly round and said, see, Mary, how a good innocent life makes friends all around. Confound it, I could make a good lesson out of it if I were a parson. But as it is, I can't get a tail to my sentences, only I'm sure you feel what I want to say. So Miss Maddie, who is just kindness itself, always, through her kindness to others, then begets more kindness from them in return, because everyone loves her. And Mary says as much. It was really very pleasant to see how her unselfishness and simple sense of justice called out the same good qualities in others. Then the final sentence of the book is, ever since that day, there has been the old friendly sociability in Cranford society, which I am thankful for because of my dear Miss Maddie's love of peace and kindliness. We all love Miss Maddie, and I somehow think we are all of us better when she is near us. It's just like really lovely. So those are the themes that I wanted to talk about. There is more, but especially like with about kind of changing times and how Cranford is kind of like still stuck in a very old-fashioned mode of things and resisting that change. But those were just kind of the three I wanted to address today. So what did I think about this as a book? It's lovely. This is delightful. This is just, I don't know, it's so nice. Like, it was just, the characters are a delight. They're funny, they're sweet. Like, you're gonna laugh, but you're also gonna tear up a bit at just the kindness and community that Gaskell shows in this book. I do generally prefer books to have more of a coherent plot than this kind of episodic style. But that said, I still really enjoyed the development of the characters, and I liked Mary as a narrator and how she's kind of both in and out of Cranford society. And I think that works really well. But I absolutely see why so many people love this book, because it really just is, like, the only word is delightful. Truly. So I gave this 4 stars. As I said, I really liked it. I just do generally prefer more of a through plot than what Cranford has, but it's still excellent and touches on some really important themes without being heavy-handed in a way that, say, Ruth was. So overall, great book, and I would highly recommend it. So that is Cranford. Next month, we will be looking at North and South, which is one of my favorite books ever, and I am so excited to reread it for like the 5th time or something like that. Let me know down in the comments, have you read Cranford? What did you think of it? What are some of the themes that you noticed? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.